it's a little bit understandable about why he's demanding that he's going to impose tariffs. One of his biggest critiques of European countries, India, China, has been the fact that they continue to buy oil from Russia. That has enabled Russia to continue to fund its war machine.
What stood out, these 3 days, what has really stood out for you at UNGA, starting with Donald Trump's address to the assembly?
Yeah, I mean, that to me has been the main thing that I was, paying attention to was what would happen with Donald Trump. I think that's the main thing that many people were paying attention to for a host of reasons. Number one, because of the presence that he carries, obviously the prominence of the United States in the international system, but more specifically to the UN, the fact that the Trump administration has been reducing its due payments to the United Nations as a key source of funding. So trying to gain some indication of, is Trump going to abandon the UN? I've even was talking to somebody, that was a question they were asking, is the US going to withdraw? And I think that the speech that Trump gave shed a light on a lot of things. First of all, I would take away from the speech that the two big themes that he laid out was that the UN is highly ineffective and highly inefficient. And what's interesting is I don't think Donald Trump is actually like unique in making that criticism. A lot of people within my own discipline of international relations would level that same critique towards the UN. Of course, it's one thing for a scholar or for someone working for a think tank or even a regular government official to make a comment like that. It's another thing for the President of the United States to be making comments like that. And so that does raise concerns. And he didn't hold back on his criticism. Now, some of that criticism was done in his own attempt to be funny and humorous, such as pointing to the escalator not working or the teleprompter or so forth. And then, of course, he also brought up his own personal experience of when he was in real estate and about how he had made an offer to remodel the UN building, but the UN chose another contractor, even though the contractor was going to be way more expensive and lower quality. But he used that as an example of this is indicative of the UN overall in terms of being inefficient. But his big thing was about the ineffectiveness. And this is where I even on Monday had said to people that, I have my bingo card of listening to the Trump speech. And one of the big things on that bingo card was he's going to mention that he has solved 6 or 7 wars. That's absolutely going to be something he's going to bring up. And sure enough, he didn't disappoint. He brought that up. And it's not just that he brought that up. That was predictable. What I thought was interesting was he then used that as a way of saying, but where was the UN? Nobody from the UN called me. Nobody from the UN tried to offer assistance. Now, is that completely a fair critique of the UN? No, because some of these conflicts happen ones where the UN has tried to play a role or hope that there would be peacekeepers, so forth. So it's not, and moreover, we could debate at length about the role that Donald Trump actually played in solving these conflicts. But nevertheless, what matters is that he made that claim and then he used it as a way of saying, but the UN wasn't there. And then he brought it back to his joke about the escalator, saying, what did I get from the UN for it? All I got was an escalator that didn't work and a teleprompter that didn't work, right? And then he also brought in the phrase that at most the UN can send a strongly worded letter that they don't even follow up on. So I thought that those were, again, that was probably some of his strongest critique of ineffectiveness. The other angle to it, besides just being inefficient and hence being an argument for reducing the money, the other part of it being the ineffectiveness and relaying of the peace. The other part was he kind of said, you could bring in like an unfocused might be part of, not Donald Trump, of course, Donald Trump, whenever he talks, it's like, where's he going with this? And, it's hard to follow, but it was more in reference to his critiques of UN programs for migration and especially refugees. And then also, of course, probably his biggest criticism was towards UN efforts combating climate change, the IPCC climate report. These things he put squarely in the frame for him to be able to critique, even going as far as to say that climate change is a hoax and these efforts to try to combat it make no sense. They're going to hold us back. It's again inefficient, ineffective, wind power, something he doesn't want to be promoting as just one example of that. So those are kind of some of the big takeaways. Again, we're still in the process of people have been giving their speeches. It is interesting to see, other leaders come up and maybe try to counter that. I do believe, for example, I think the one that really stood out to me was, I think Erdogan, Turkey, probably, leveling his own critiques towards Trump. And of course, some of this he's been leveling in other avenues, such as I think he gave an interview. I believe this week was the interview where he said basically that, Trump promised to fix Ukraine. Trump promised to fix Gaza. Neither of these have been fixed. What's he doing? So, it's evident that leaders are not wary of holding back with him. And then the final thing that was really notable, again, I realize this is more US focused, but to me, I think that's obviously where I am. This is going to be a big focus, but also I just think for the UN 80 as a whole, this was a big focus, was all the bilateral meetings that he had, and notably the meetings that he had with Zelensky of Ukraine, and how suddenly that has led to a change in his rhetoric regarding Ukraine. So I think those bilateral meetings were also really important. But overall, that's my takeaway from it. I don't think Trump is going to pull the U.S. out of the UN. I think he values going to the UN and giving speeches too much to do that. I think also he recognizes the U.S. has both power through its position on the UN Security Council, but also has kind of a global bully pulpit, if you will, and he's not going to want to give that up. But it is absolutely the case that he has leveled these criticisms of ineffective and inefficient.
Right. Another thing that stood out for me was how he criticized Europe, for funding war against themselves. Now, China, EU, and Turkey, would they face tariff next? And what's really interesting, as we speak right now, you have the Turkish in the Oval Office right now, trying to have that conversation with him. How do you think this is going to play out? Because he has repeatedly said that, yes, tariffs would be placed for countries like Turkey, the European nations, and China going forward.
Yeah, this obviously he loves tariffs. Going back to his first term, he labeled himself a tariff man, and going into this term, throughout the campaign, he kept bringing up tariffs as a policy that he was going to favor, and that has proven to be the case during his first several months in office, where he's obviously leveled these tariffs in general, flat 10% rate, but then obviously having these varying rates for everybody else. He has used that both as a means of what at least members of his economic team have argued is a need for correction to global imbalances. There is a little bit of truth to that. Whether the tariff is the appropriate way to fix that is another matter. But obviously, and hence to your question, he's also been turning to tariffs as just an overall policy tool. Any type of means of coercion, even if the policy that he's trying to correct doesn't necessarily have anything to do with tariffs, or wouldn't even be something that you would necessarily turn to tariffs to use. He views tariffs as a means of effective economic coercion, separate from economic sanctions more generally, which of course have been used, and maybe in some instances sanctioning a specific type of economic transaction might be more appropriate than leveling a massive tariff on all goods coming from a country. But that is where he's coming in. Now, there is a little bit it's a little bit understandable about why he's demanding that he's going to impose tariffs, because one of his biggest critiques of European countries, India, China, has been the fact that they continue to buy oil from Russia, and that has enabled Russia to continue to fund its war machine. That has been a key part, that despite the level of sanctions that were imposed going back to 2022, and of course Russia was already under sanctions prior to that, including sanctions that Trump himself had imposed during his first term, but these sanctions ramped up with the full invasion of Ukraine. And but despite that, countries continue to buy Russian energy, Russian oil. European countries, despite the fact that, yes, they have reduced the amount of Russian energy that they've been purchasing, they are still acquiring energy from Russia. And countries like India have really just taken advantage of the fact that Russia has been selling this oil at a discount. And they're, India in some ways, and we can talk more about India, but I kind of view India as recently being the epitome of the realpolitik country. They're like, you know what? We're not condoning the war, but we might as well take advantage of the cheap energy. And I think that that's been a big part of where they've come in. But I think that has now led Trump to say, no, that's not acceptable because the best way to stop Russia is to completely cut off their ability to sell oil. So as long as there are some European countries continuing to buy any Russian oil or gas, as long as India continues to do that, and of course China, but China is in kind of a very different category. European countries are, of course, fighting Russia, which is where he comes into you're fighting yourselves. Um, India, as I said, they're kind of like just on the outskirts and being like, we're not involved, so we're just going to buy oil. China is in a different category because China is in many ways assisting Russia. They're an ally of Russia. So their situation is a little more, I guess you could say, understandable about why they've been buying Russian energy. But because of US connections to China, that's why they're also under this target by Trump.
Let's just talk about, the mixed signals that come out of Washington, D.C. in terms of foreign policy. Now, and let's just talk about India specific. Rubio, of course, understands geopolitics. He understands how China is a threat in the region. And what do you really make of comments from other cabinet members of the Trump administration criticizing India and using language that is so different from what Rubio understands?
I mean, this has been a big thing that I know people have been trying to get a handle on over the past, say, month and a half, ever since Trump, first came out and said he was going to level these major tariffs against India. That even led to when you had then, of course, the meeting between Xi and Modi on the related to the meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, people making a big deal about that meeting because of the fact that Modi was going to China to actually meet. And that even leading people to say that the U.S. was, going to, quote, lose India. Now, that led me to talk about, first of all, India was not the U.S.'s to lose, just like going back to when that phrase would be used back in the late 1940s and 1950s. It was used to refer to China and say, the U.S. has lost China. It's like it's not theirs to lose. But especially in the case of India, it's like I put India in the category of if they're not a great power already, they are absolutely an aspiring great power. They wish to behave and wish to be viewed as a great power, and they're absolutely one of these emerging great powers. The reason why that matters is countries that are of that type and countries that aspire to be that type, they're not countries you manipulate. They're not countries that, oh, because we did that, India is now going to sit there and say, oh, well, since you're being mean to us, we're going to turn to China. It's like, no, they're going to turn to China if it's in their interest to turn to China, regardless of the behavior of the United States, and vice versa. They're going to turn to the US regardless of China's behavior. That's what great powers do. Great powers don't, they aren't pushed and pulled around. And I think India, whether you want to say that they are a great power or not say they're a great power, they absolutely want to behave like a great power, which means they're not going to be manipulated back and forth and be like, oh, well, you're pushing us towards China. We have no choice. They're going to take this action if that's in their interest. And I think what we have seen over the past few weeks is indeed the situation is not quite as, I guess you could say from the US perspective, as dire as it was when people were saying, oh, the Trump administration has lost India. It's like, no, I think they're still very much in play. They still very much want to cooperate, and it's not clear that they're fully on board with Xi Jinping and China. I mean, it's important to remember that yes, it is true that Modi met with Xi, but it's also the case that Modi was not one of the honorary guests at the big thing, which was the military parade that was held for the 80th anniversary of the defeat of Japan. Instead, the guests of honor were, as one would predict, was Kim Jong-un of North Korea and Vladimir Putin of Russia. They were the guests of honor. Modi was not part of that entourage. So that already points to it's like, no, they're not, they're not receiving the special treatment that one would expect if suddenly they're now moving over into China's orbit. Far from it. And again, I think that goes to the idea that India is very much a country that is trying to position itself as it historically has, trying to position itself as not really in anyone's camp fully. Yes, there's times to work with China, we'll work with China. But if there's times to work with the United States, we'll work with the United States. It is absolutely the case that the high tariffs that at least the Trump administration is claiming or wants to impose on India is something that is obviously not popular, but at the same time, there's been attempts to try to negotiate that and work that out. So yes, I think this is why the situation is more complicated, is more complex, is not as dire as one would think. And part of that could also be for the reasons that you brought up, that Marco Rubio does have a lot of influence on U.S. foreign policy. And I think that Rubio serves as a break to say, hey, wait, no, India is real important for us. I mean, in many ways, he is the most powerful Secretary of State since Henry Kissinger. And so that does put him in a position that if his view is India is important for us, we need to be able to work with them. You got to be careful about just slapping big tariffs on them and so forth. Then I think that's also going to play a role.
Right. Now, Professor, the last few months have been like this hot and cold relationship between the two countries. But one thing that stood out is the digital diplomacy, or say the exchange between the two leaders. What do you make of that?
So I'm glad we're recording this because I don't really have like much to say about the exact, exchange between the two of them.
Okay.
So maybe you can remove that from the recording here,
yeah, that's fine.
That's one that I just don't have. I don't have an opinion on. I could formulate one, but I just don't have one right off of my top of my head.
Okay, sounds good. No worries. Now, 4 years ago, or the Biden administration, to be precise, was okay with India buying crude or energy from Russia. And now here you are, this administration wants to end that. So there are these confusing signals, or, this conflicting policies. Do you think that America is a reliable partner for India?
This is the conflicting signals is absolutely something that one should be asking about, especially when you go from Biden administration to Trump administration and you're like, what can we trust? Who can we rely on? And that's actually like a more fundamental question about just democracies in general. And it's not specific to the US, but that if you have a new leader, does that lead to such a big change in foreign policy that they're not predictable? So I think that's a general critique. But in the case of going from Biden to Trump, yes, I think that this is a point of concern because what's interesting is, the Biden was in many ways, I labeled Biden, and this is probably, now that I think about it, I think this goes a long way towards why he's like, well, you know what, India's going to do this, but we're not going to worry too much about it. Is because I think Biden also, much more so than Trump, had kind of this realpolitik view of foreign policy. I often refer to Biden as his foreign policy view being realpolitik with a liberal internationalist flair, that he would talk a lot about liberal internationalism and the need for cooperation in institutions and so forth. But if you actually looked at what he would do and even things he would say at times, it was much more like, is this in the nation's interest? No, not really. Okay, we're going to move on. And also understanding that other countries are going to behave that way as well. Case in point that I think many would highlight would be the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. He's like, nope, this is not what we're going to do anymore. He had long wanted the U.S. to pull out of Afghanistan. Even when he was vice president, he wanted the U.S. to pull out. And of course, as vice president, he can't make that call. My understanding is that that was something he was very frustrated with Obama. But once he was president, that was one of the first things he did is we're going to follow through with this. We're not going to back out, even though it was Trump who signed the actual agreement to withdraw. He's going to do that. I bring that up to say that that is an example that people have pointed to of where Biden very much had this realpolitik view that like international politics is not about necessarily friends and foes per se. It is about nations following their interests and kind of having a tolerance for that. So I think that goes a part of the way towards why with India, he was like, look, India is doing what they think is in their best interest. And moreover, because Biden kind of had that, like, I mean, it was very well known that Biden had a lot of knowledge and a lot of expertise for foreign policy. That's why he was Obama's vice president. I think he could also see the bigger field, if you will. He could say, we're going to tolerate India buying this energy from Russia because we need India in the Quad, for example, to be able to balance against China. And that is one thing that I think was very much a common thread through Biden's administration was everything was about balancing China. His summit of democracies that he brought together.
Yeah.
That was, I mean, even some of the countries that were part of that, it was questionable about how democratic they were. But I remember at the time of those summits, I was doing some interviews where I said, the best way to understand who's been invited to that is it's who's not been invited. And it's China that hasn't been invited. It's really about balancing China. It's about creating this coalition to balance China. So that was kind of Biden's view of things. Trump has a bit of a different view. Trump, if you even go back to when he was president the first time, one of his biggest criticisms of NATO allies wasn't just that they weren't spending enough on defense. That was something, he had long done, and he wasn't an outlier for that. It was European allies buying Russian energy. That was actually the big breakdown. I think it was the 2017 NATO summit where he basically yelled at, I think, if I remember correctly, I think he yelled at Merkel for the fact that Germany was still buying because of Nord Stream and energy coming in. And it's like, why are you making yourself economically dependent on the very country that you're trying to counter against? So Trump has long made that like a focal point that like, if Russia is this threat, you don't buy energy from them. And I think much more so than whereas Biden had more of a tolerance for that. So it's not surprising. And again, this is something that since the beginning of the war, India has played this key role of being willing to buy the energy from Russia, largely out of their own interests, largely because it's like, well, we can buy it at a 30% discount. Why would we not do that? But I think Trump, again, has more of this view that, no, that is like the best. That is how Russia's thriving. And I don't care if you're India. I don't care if you're the European countries. I don't care who you are. If you're buying that, that's not an acceptable policy. And so that's where I think if you will, kind of the whiplash comes in, that it's like Biden was much more tolerant because of his realpolitik view. Trump is much more like energy is the key way that Russia thrives. Anybody who's buying it, I don't care who it is going to be liable to this criticism.
Right. Talking about the trade deal as negotiations are on as we speak, will the India-US trade deal, according to you, separate from this whole Russia oil issue, or will it be like in tandem?
As someone who wrote their PhD dissertation years ago about issue linkage, I would tend to think that they're going to go in tandem, right? The two things can't be fully separated. That's one answer to it at like a very, 30,000 foot level. But I think there's another thing that's real important to keep in mind, especially more specifically to the Trump administration, which is that the deals that they have reached so far on trade haven't really been trade deals. They've been more framework deals. And what we mean by framework deals is they're like, well, we have an agreement on the issues that we're going to eventually have some provisions for and discussions on and adjustments to. And so many of these have been more of these framework deals that then are, kind of just, one way to say it is kick the can down the road in terms of, all right, well, later on, we'll still deal with this. But what that means is they can be very general. And I could see that absolutely being the case. It allows the Trump administration to say, look, we reached a deal. This is going to be great for Americans. And then people start going, yeah, but like, are you going to reduce the tariffs? Have you reduced the tariffs? Or, what did you actually get out of doing this? Because it seems like everything's still the same. So I wouldn't be shocked if after all the dust settles with these negotiations, that at the end it's going to be like, okay, there's a new deal. It allows Trump to claim there's a deal, but fundamentally it just caused a lot of like consternation or not really much of an outcome in terms of actually changing anything. And I think that's the criticism you could level with the agreement with Vietnam. You could level that with the agreement with the UK, with the EU, all this. That it's like these, to what extent was all the bluster, whether it was tariffs, whether it was criticism, well, actually necessary to reach the kind of deal that was reached. And I just think that I think a deal with India is going to be in the same camp, that it's going to allow Trump to be able to say, oh, okay, we've got this great deal and India is a terrific partner, et cetera. But it's not going to fundamentally, there's still going to be a lot of questions of like, okay, now what are the specifics? A business owner is going to be like, okay, what's the rate I'm actually paying if this is coming through? Those things are still not going to be answered.
Right. Now, another development is the US-Pakistan relationship. Just the leaders are going to be meeting at the Oval shortly. And it's not just the Pakistani Prime Minister, but it's also General Munir who will be a part of this conversation at the Oval today. Why include a military chief in a democracy like America?
There's a lot of ways to read into it. Obviously, if I had inside knowledge to do exactly what the Trump administration is doing or Pakistan's government was doing, then I could, precisely answer this. However, I think what I could infer from it is the Trump administration has made very clear, even to the extent of renaming the Department of Defense, the Department of War. They have made very clear the idea that they're very comfortable with the fact that military affairs is central part of what governments do. And so I can completely see where, especially if you start looking at other things, if you start looking at like Bagram, the fact that the Trump administration is making these demands to regain the air base in Afghanistan. And the reason why is because they're like, we want to be able to have military presence towards China. I can completely see where the Trump administration is viewing the importance of Pakistan from that frame. They are an ally who gives us, if you want to use the word that we use, access. If we have a presence there, it puts us that much closer to China, puts our assets closer to China and Iran. And indeed, recently with the attack, the Midnight Hammer that happened a few months ago, that was enabled by having this type of access, by having U.S. bases, U.S. personnel in other countries, so forth. So I think we're viewed from that framework that the Trump administration absolutely has military policy as like the forefront of foreign policy. Then it makes sense that it's like, well, why would we not have Pakistan's military officials be part of this conversation? Because that's like a central part of why we're going to be talking with them. What's interesting is that's not really a departure for the United States. Pakistan's always been critical from a security standpoint. It's just that the Trump administration is much more, hence renaming Department of Defense, Department of War. They're just much more willing to be open about it and be like, look, yeah, we want military officials here because we want them to talk to our military officials, or Trump wants to talk to them directly. So I think that for me would be what this points to.
Okay. Now, the Saudi-Pakistani defense deal is another thing that has come up in the days. What are the implications of this defense deal, especially given Saudi's intentions or Saudi's tensions with Israel, the strongest ally of America?
Yeah, this is where international politics starts to become really complicated, right? Is these conflicting or overlapping alliances. In many ways, what's notable to me, and I almost thought about writing like a piece about this, but that you are seeing a number of these countries starting, or at least considering, forming military alliances. I think Australia and Papua New Guinea was looking at this, but then China kind of stepped in to kind of try to break that up. And I think Saudi Arabia and Pakistan's agreement kind of falls into this similar camp. Now, on the one hand, an agreement, a mutual defense pact between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia could make a lot of sense from Saudi Arabia's standpoint. Again, because from Saudi Arabia's viewpoint, the biggest threat to the region and to their interests is Iran. Full stop. That is the biggest threat to the region. That was potentially going to be the basis for why Saudi Arabia and Israel, I think a key goal, and I still think a key goal for the Trump administration, is to have the two of them join as part of this Abraham Accords that's been signed, where various countries throughout the Middle East have been normalizing, Middle East and North Africa have been normalizing relations with Israel. And I think that that's kind of like, from Trump's standpoint, that is like the thing he most wants to achieve. And I think that was even evident in his recent tour to the region, where he's like, he wants to be able to achieve that. And the reason why that's feasible is because Saudi Arabia, one thing that Saudi Arabia and Israel agree on is Iran being a threat. That is one thing they agree on. Now, there have been some attempts to try to thaw relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. They've been making some, they've been having some visits and so forth. But, there were attempts between the United States and Soviet Union to have détente too, and they were still rivals, and they still viewed each other as having diametrically opposed interests. So bringing Pakistan on board and having Pakistan move more into their orbit versus potentially moving towards Iran's orbit makes complete sense, and in many ways works in the same of what we were just talking about with the Trump administration. That, the Trump administration has very good relations with Saudi Arabia, and so in that sense, it kind of works together. You could see where those two things are working together, that they're in this effort of trying to isolate Iran. So I wouldn't be shocked at all to know if Saudi Arabia and Pakistan are actually doing this with, if you will, if you want to use the phrase, the blessing of the United States, of saying, no, this is great. We want you to do this because it works within a overall strategy of isolating Iran.
All right. On that note, thank you so much for talking to us. Really appreciate your impressions here. Thank you, Paul.